one of the things that I've been kind of going off of is I look at Justin Fields, who, look, the Bears moved on from him for a reason. He's not a good NFL quarterback, or hasn't been to this point, but he's been an incredibly useful fantasy quarterback because of his rushing ability. I kind of view that as Jayden Daniels' downside as a rookie. At the very least, I feel like he'll be useful as a runner. Do you think that's a fair assessment of Jayden Daniels as a fantasy asset?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to note when in pre-draft and talking to evaluators and scouts, et cetera, about Daniels, like they emphasize, look, he's a passer first, then a runner. It's not the other way around. So just be clear to everybody, be clear on that. But that said, when you have the mobility that he has, that definitely gives you a much higher ceiling than if fantasy owners are just relying on him to throw the ball. The biggest question for me with Daniels is, can he avoid the hits? I don't mean like you're going to get tackled, you're going to get sacked, but I keep saying these cartoonish hits that he was taking in college. I mean, if you see I guess they're not highlights, but like if you see a package of him getting smoked by defenders, it's not your standard, he's just got a blindside hit. It's like he's just like, I don't know, he needs to work on his field awareness, peripheral view. That to me is the issue. So if he can avoid that, then I think his running ability will help carry the day in fantasy, not to mention in the hearts of Commanders fans.
What?
Why are you shaking your head? You're welcome.
Kliff Kingsbury is back in the NFL and is calling plays for the Commanders. What is the fantasy outlook for his weapons in Washington? Can rookie quarterback Jayden Daniels help Jahan Dotson rebound from a disappointing sophomore campaign? And why is Brian Robinson one of the most underrated backs in fantasy? Ben Standig from The Athletic tells me why he thinks so in our discussion. My name is Joe Dolan. Like this video, leave a comment, and subscribe to the Fantasy Points YouTube channel for 32 fantasy football breakdowns of all 32 NFL teams. All right, Ben, I want to take a big approach here, the macro approach. Kliff Kingsbury is the offensive coordinator for the Commanders. What are you expecting this offense to look like? And will it be in any way really different from what Kingsbury ran with the Arizona Cardinals?
Yeah, it's a great question. Just as an overview of where this team is right now, they recognize that the biggest advantage they have is that nobody quite knows exactly what to make of them. So they're going to do their best to not reveal, even not when asked by their local reporter, what's going on. They don't really want to give us that. So it's a little hard to know. Obviously, Jayden Daniels fits perfectly with what we perceive to be the Kliff Kingsbury offense, this up-tempo, wide open deal. Obviously, Kyler Murray had a lot of success as a mobile threat who could throw for Kingsbury. I understand, like, conventionally we're thinking of 3 receivers, 4 receivers. I don't know how much I'm seeing that right now. When you look at this team, other than Terry McLaurin and Jahan Dotson, who kind of was coming off a poor year last year, their receiver room is very unsettled. They do have 2 good running backs in Brian Robinson and Austin Ekeler. We'll see where Eckler's at this year. And then the tight end room is, they drafted Ben Sinnott in the second round. They have Zach Ertz. I don't know that they have a ton of weapons to spread things out, but I do think they've got to protect Jayden Daniels. The offensive line's a bit shaky. So I can kind of see a little bit more 2 tight end and more emphasis on the running back than 3 and 4 receivers. But I still would expect an up-tempo offense, take advantage of Daniels' dual threat ability. But yeah, it's a bit of a mystery as to what exactly Kingsbury is going to want to do.
The Commanders were 18th in the NFL in plays per game, right around 62 last year. It sounds like you anticipate that going up pretty significantly.
I mean, you would think so. Look, obviously, if Jayden Daniels struggled, then you're going to have to dial things back just to accommodate the rookie. And you would think they're going to slow certain aspects down anyway. But if you believe that Jayden Daniels will be allowed to really kind of run the offense quickly, and, as it stands now, pre-training camp, I think they're heading in that direction. He's going to be the starter. We can dispense with any questions there, but that would be my only wonder is how quickly is he picking up the offense? If he's good to go, in and out of the huddle, all that type of stuff, then I think they will be able to run a bit more up tempo. Yeah.
I think one of the things that fantasy players were most disappointed in with the Commanders last year is that in 17 games in his sophomore campaign, Jahan Dotson had fewer receiving yards than he had in 12 games as a rookie. What happened there? Was there a disconnect with the coaching staff? And is there an anticipation that he's going to bounce back this year?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and it is definitely an interesting one for sure. Look, I think Jahan Dotson's first year, the 7 touchdowns on 35 catches was obviously a bit of an outlier as far as like production, right? But then last year, I remember early in the season, Dotson was talking about how he didn't feel he was being used in the red zone in the same way under Eric Bieniemy as OC compared to Scott Turner previously. He's not a big receiver, obviously, but he's got pretty good hands, got a good vertical. They drafted him specifically because he has pretty good catch radius. That was something they were really trying to emphasize that year when Carson Wentz was the quarterback. I just think that Bieniemy just did not see using Dotson the same way. I think maybe for Sam Howell, who tended to like to see the receiver get open before he would throw the ball, maybe Dotson wasn't getting enough separation. In fact, if you look at ESPN's, I think it's called open catch metric, Dotson and Terry McLaurin are ranked towards the bottom of wide receivers last year. So I think inability to create space, whether that was directly for the receivers, I kind of think maybe it was, as well as the play calls, I think hindered a quarterback who didn't quite trust to throw without space. One thing that's been discussed though in minicamp and OTAs, Terry McLaurin brought this up, that for Jahan Dotson, he noticed that when he's running some crossers, you've got to turn your head around quick because he's not waiting for you to quote unquote get open. He's throwing it to a spot, assuming you will be open. So that could be a way to benefit Dotson and McLaurin this year. But yeah, there were some odd circumstances last year for sure.
Touchdowns are a fickle beast in fantasy football, as you're well aware. Terry McLaurin's gone over 1,000 yards each of the last 4 seasons, but maxing out at 5 receiving touchdowns is going to limit his fantasy upside. I could throw the question out there, is he going to score more touchdowns? I don't know if you have any way to answer that. So what I'm going to pivot to is, what is Terry McLaurin saying about the Kliff Kingsbury offense? What's he saying about Jayden Daniels that might give us a little bit of hope that those touchdowns might happen this year?
Well, I think one thing on both sides of the ball, there was not a lot of creativity. It was kind of like, Terry, okay, you line up with the X on the left, and we'll just go from there. And they didn't move him around. He did talk about moving around more this year with what Kingsbury is looking to do. He even talked about possibly being in the slot. We'll see about that. But it sounds like that's going to be more of the case. And this is not about McLaurin per se, but last year Dotson was running obviously a lot more outside with Curtis Samuel, kind of the slot guy. We've seen so far in minicamp that they had Dotson, I think, a little bit more in the slot with Luke McCaffrey on the outside a bit, even though McCaffrey was drafted. People thought he'd be a slot, but he's the bigger guy. So I think moving players around should help. And, look, Terry McLaurin has had zero consistency at quarterback his entire career. It's been a different week one starter every year. And none of those people would you advise in real time for people to pick up as their fantasy quarterback. So it's been a tough journey for him, but hopefully Kingsbury and Daniels gives McLaurin more stability, and Kingsbury can find ways to get him open. That just really wasn't the case last year.
We saw Kliff Kingsbury in Arizona at times run a lot of 10 personnel. Now, you mentioned a little bit earlier that you're not sure the 4 wide receiver set thing is going to happen with the Commanders, but I would anticipate 3 wide receiver sets are going to be really popular. I mean, they're popular with just about everybody, but certainly with Kliff Kingsbury. Does the rookie Luke McCaffrey have the upper hand to be the slot receiver in those 3 wide receiver sets?
I would think so right now. Again, he's of the receivers that we're expecting to play, he's the tallest. He's not Calvin Johnson. I mean, he's just a shade under 6'2". But for this group, that is something. I think one of the issues I had the last couple of years was that McLaurin, Samuel, and Dotson, they're not the exact same receiver or build, but they're all roughly about 6 foot 5'11", and there was no variance, I think, there in terms of height. At least McCaffrey gives you a little bit more. Part of the issue, I think, with them this year is their receiver room, just a lot of question marks after him. Zacchaeus, who's been around the league for a little bit, I'm penciling him in as the 4th guy, but he's a 5'8" player who didn't have much production last year at all.
Yeah.
With the Eagles, right? And then De'Ami Brown, he's basically been a bit of a disappointment so far through 3 years as a third-round pick. And then from there, is Jamison Crowder going to play, or is he going to just make the team as a punt returner, et cetera? So I just don't think they have a ton of proven options. Now, again, we'll see what happens. Zaccheaus has been a guy that's caught 30, 40 passes in a year. Maybe they find a way to get him more involved. But right now, I think McCaffrey would be my bet. But from a fantasy perspective, there's nobody else there beyond McLaurin and perhaps Dotson late rounds that I'm even looking at right now.
So I'm looking at the tight end position. There was a lot of excitement in the fantasy community early in the offseason process about Ben Sinnott, the rookie out of Kansas State who was taken in the second round. He was a Senior Bowl guy, had some good practices down there. But it seems like there's a buzz about Zach Ertz. And Zach Ertz obviously has played in this offense. He's familiar with the offense. Is that buzz legitimate? And should we anticipate that there's going to be a little bit of a learning curve, or at least a curve to get onto the field for the rookie Sinnott?
Yeah. I'm trying to think if I had something to do with this buzz on Zach Ertz, because I think I've tweeted once or twice that he surprised me with his speed in camp. There was a couple plays where somebody caught a ball. I'm like, oh, that guy's trucking, and this whole team has changed so much. I really have to look at the roster to remember whose number is what. And I was like, oh, Zach Ertz, look at you. Look, I don't know what Zach Ertz really has left in the tank, but he was with Kingsbury for 2 years with Arizona. When you bring in a guy like that, right, it's to help spread the joy of the Kingsbury offense to everybody else, also to give the rookie quarterback a veteran target at that spot. So I think Zach Ertz is going to get a chance to be the guy. Again, from a fantasy perspective, do I see him doing enough? Let me see how healthy he is, and let's see how he looks speed-wise and otherwise as we get into the season. As for Ben Sinnott, very fascinating player. What's interesting about him is when they drafted him, GM Adam Peters said that he liked him because he thought he had some George Kittle in him, as well as some Kyle Juszczyk. Of course, Peters was with San Fran. The Kyle Juszczyk mention is fascinating because
yes,
pretty rare H-back. That's not a guy you would think, hey, this is a fantasy help at all. But I do think this is possibly their way to get two tight ends on the field, have that extra receiver be somebody that can be a blocker, whether it's for the run game or as the pass game, and give and still give you a weapon. So I think Ertz is if you made me pick, I would still go with Ertz, but Sinnott is the one who's easily more intriguing long term, especially if you're in a dynasty league.
So the backfield, not necessarily rebuilt, but there is a key addition here in the person of Austin Ekeler. And I think that's scaring fantasy players a little bit away from Brian Robinson, who's been more of an early down guy in his career. Obviously, we know Ekeler can catch passes. What's your outlook for Brian Robinson this season, who I feel like has been kind of an underrated back in his 2 years in the league?
I agree with you on the underrated part. Obviously, their offense has not been very good, so the touchdowns have not really been there. Past is not necessarily prologue, but just to look back at Kingsbury's time with the Cardinals, in those 4 years, Kenyon Drake and James Conner each had 10-plus touchdown seasons. I think they combined for over 40 rushing touchdowns. If that trend continues, then Brian Robinson, I think, is going to get a lot of opportunities at the goal line. And granted, Jayden Daniels could steal some things, but they had Kyler Murray in Arizona, obviously not the same size if you're talking inside the red zone, but a fast quarterback that you could do some things with. I like Robinson a lot. Like you said, he's also a pretty underrated pass catcher. Yes. Ekeler is a huge question mark for this team. I don't mean question mark in a bad way, but question mark in terms of the projection on this team is 6 to 7 wins, let's just say. If they were to surprise, I think it's going to have to be a few guys like Ekeler who show that they have a form that they had a couple of years ago when they were leading the league in touchdowns. I don't see him getting that type of workload or getting that type of touches. I think he's more in the maybe 8 to 12 touch range, depending on, game flow, things like that. If he can be a weapon for Daniels out of the backfield, I mean, that's pretty huge for this team, but I would still like Robinson, and I don't know how confident I can be, but I think, based on the history with Kingsbury and what Robinson can do, I think Robinson's poised for a good year. And I would say, 6 to 7, maybe even more touchdowns.
Have you had a chance to speak to Austin Ekeler, and does he have kind of a chip on his shoulder?
Austin Ekeler is an interesting guy. He's got a lot of interests outside of football. He kind of presents himself when he talks to us as a guy who's, I don't want to say pitching product, but like he's very polished. Like I could see him going on Shark Tank, and say, "Hey, Sharks, I'm Austin Ekeler. Here's why you should want to invest in me this year." But yes, I mean, I think when we've asked him kind of what went wrong last year, he pointed to he got this high ankle sprain in week 1, and that kind of set things back. Then the team itself just started to fall apart, as we know, and that doesn't help anybody when your defense is giving up gobs of points. It's not really going to lead to a lot with the run game. So I think he's hopeful and optimistic that he's got a lot more to show. He's back with Anthony Lynn, who was his former head coach with the Chargers, who is now one of the offensive assistants in Washington. That combination, he's also in charge of the running backs and the run game. So I think having Lynn certainly will mean a coach is there who knows how best to use Ekeler. So I think that should help as well. But yeah, I think he's clearly looking for a much bigger year than what we saw last year.
So I want to talk about Jayden Daniels now as the prospect, as the player, and as a fantasy asset. One of the things that I've been kind of going off of is I look at Justin Fields, who, look, the Bears moved on from him for a reason. He's not a good NFL quarterback, or hasn't been to this point, but he's been an incredibly useful fantasy quarterback because of his rushing ability. I kind of view that as Jayden Daniels' downside as a rookie. At the very least, I feel like he'll be useful as a runner. Do you think that's a fair assessment of Jayden Daniels as a fantasy asset?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to note when in pre-draft and talking to evaluators and scouts, et cetera, about Daniels, like they emphasize, look, he's a passer first, then a runner. It's not the other way around. So just be clear to everybody, be clear on that. But that said, when you have the mobility that he has, that definitely gives you a much higher ceiling than if if fantasy owners are just relying on him to throw the ball. Again, especially not a ton of weapons relative to maybe other teams. There's questions on the offensive line. But his ability to run, I think, will absolutely raise his ceiling to a pretty good level. The biggest question for me with Daniels is, can he avoid the hits? I don't mean like you're going to get tackled, you're going to get sacked, but I keep saying these cartoonish hits that he was taking in college. I mean, if you see I guess they're not highlights, but like if you see a package of him getting smoked by defenders, it's not your standard, he's just got a blindside hit. It's like he's just like, I don't know. He needs to work on his field awareness, peripheral view. That to me is the issue. So if he can avoid that, then I think his running ability will help carry the day in fantasy, not to mention in the hearts of Commanders fans.
Ben Standig covers the Commanders and the NFL for the Athletic. You can catch him on the Standig Room Only pod. He brought John Hansen on his pod. We had a little cross-pollination going on here, but he's a recurring guest on the Fantasy Franchise Focus. You can follow him on Twitter at Ben Standig. There's no N before the G, so there's a play on words there with the Standig Room Only pod. Ben, thank you so much for joining me again on the Franchise Focus. It's been a pleasure having you.
Joe, man, always a pleasure, man. Look forward to talking more during the season. Good luck.